Okay, cool. So the motion is the one on feminism. I'm just going to read it out for the sake of everybody. The feminists should reject legal and conventional presumptions that are favourable to women. For example, presumptive custody of children, women and children first in disasters and emergencies, etc. I would like to invite the first affirmative speaker up to open the motion that stands in their name. Here.
Can you guys hear me? Right. I think we should clear up early on that most feminists do not actually spend a lot of time advocating for women to get custody of all children in court, advocating for women to be evacuated first in emergencies, or advocating that men should always buy women the first drink. The context in which these conversations are being had, where feminists would reasonably be put in a position where they should reject these concepts, is when a man is bringing up how unfair it is that women are prioritized in these situations. We think it is pretty reasonable that when a man does do this, feminists should acknowledge that sometimes they aren't always the best ideas, sometimes they aren't the most equitable ideas, and in reality are actually harmful to women in a lot of situations. Two things in this speech. Firstly, why we think these perceptions are actually just don't provide any tangible benefits to women, and secondly, why this leads to disillusionment with the feminist movement and stops pro-women policy. So firstly, why do we think these perceptions actually don't do very much for women, and why they're actually unhelpful in a lot of situations? I'm going to deal with this with 3 specific examples, because I think you can see that most of these perceptions arise out of the perspective of women as either someone who should be infantilized, someone who should be a caretaker, or someone who should just be submissive to men. So I'm going to deal with each of these in order. The first one, the view of women as needing to be evacuated first, needing to be taken out of safety to women. We think that this just arises out of an infantilistic view of women as being unable to fend for themselves, right? As being the most vulnerable people in every situation. Why is this harmful? Because obviously 2024, I think we can have a little bit more nuance about this, right? So yes, in an emergency evacuation, right, we should be trying to get the most vulnerable people out of there. This is just not always women though, right? There's people with other disabilities, people with other causes, issues that or people who are less strong than some strong women who should be evacuated first. It just doesn't make sense to me why there is any material need for women to always be evacuated first, when there are probably some men who are much weaker and unable to get themselves out there as well. So we just think that in that example, it's just not helpful at all. The second example is arises out of the perception that women should always be the caretaker. So you see this in actually, going back to the first point about how this infantilizes women, we tell you this is a form of social conditioning, right? That ever since you're a child, you're told that women should be saved first in emergencies, and we tell you that being fed this as a child means that you inherently view women as not as strong as men, and we think that this kind of social conditioning leads into other sexist attitudes from men, because they then believe that women aren't as strong as men, and we think it's also harmful for children, young girls, to hear that they aren't as strong as men, and we think this is just really harmful social conditioning. What does this mean is that the counterfactual is then not that women are completely disregarded in these situations. It's we probably think more equitably about who needs help to leave, and we also think that it's not an overt return to sexism, because we think we have less of this harmful social conditioning. Okay, moving on to the second perception, and the second example, that women typically get custody of children in family court more often, presumptive custody. We tell you that this isn't actually that good for women at all, right? Why? Because it just arises out of the idea that women should inherently take care of the children. What is the counterfactual to this? The counterfactual is that the child goes to the primary caregiver, or whoever has the means to take care of the child. It's probably split custody in most situations, right? We agree that if a woman is the primary caretaker of a child, she should have custody of her child. We do not agree with the automatic assumption that that this should go to her. We think it is unfair to men when they are the primary caregiver. Secondly, we just think it's a burden to women, like raising a child and like not being able to pursue your career, the intense amount of emotional and financial investment, like isn't something that you should like automatically push to one gender. We don't think this is helpful to women at all. And we tell you, like, even if like when you're like getting a divorce, like if the woman hasn't been working and like can't afford lawyers and whatever, we think our legal system is like pretty good at dealing with this, pretty good at getting legal aid. So in the event that a woman should be getting custody of her child, we like think that she probably will in most cases. We just don't think it should be an automatic assumption. And then the third example I'm going to deal with is this kind of like chivalrous perception that like men should be chivalrous to women, men should buy like women a drink first, men should always buy like a first dinner. We think this just literally like feeds into the stereotype of men thinking that you like owe them something. Like literally any woman who has ever had a man buy them a drink knows that that man is then going to like ask for something in return. We also think it creates a relationship of dependency, and we also just think it feeds into the stereotype that men should like primarily be the breadwinners, right? What's the counterfactual to this? Just like whoever like asks the other person out on a date pays for the date. Like we don't think that like, we just think this is like such an insignificant benefit to women that they like maybe don't have to pay for dinner sometimes, which actually causes like real harms in the perception of that man towards this woman. So now that I've proved that this like actually doesn't have any real benefit to women, why is this bad? What are the consequences? We tell you that these things are like consistently used as scapegoats for not enacting pro-women policy and also for disillusionment with the feminist movement. Why? These presumptions lead to like three things, right? Firstly, genuine frustration from men when they see these things happen. So firstly, they feel like the family law system is super unfair, that like mental health talks always surround women. And we think that this kind of like upset and disappointment leads to them not supporting feminism because they just feel like they fundamentally be wronged. We think that when a feminist validates their opinions on this and say, yes, we think it's unfair that children always go to the mother, they are then more likely going to agree with feminists in the future because they see now that this isn't something that feminists believe in. Secondly, we tell you that these like perceptions are frequently used by men as a reason that like feminism isn't a necessary social cause anymore, because there's a perspective that not only do women have equal rights to men, but they actually benefit in certain situations, like not having to pay for dinner on the first date, like being able like being favored in family court, right? And we think that this like directly decreases political capital for women at the point where men think that women actually have it better than them because of these like certain examples. Thirdly, we tell you that like it also increases disillusion with feminism because it actually just makes feminists seem out of touch sometimes when like engaging in political discourse, right? So for example, like often feminists will be seen to like look like they're prioritizing women. So for example, like the rhetoric around Gaza right now, you'll hear a lot of people saying, oh, like women and children are dying. I think that like very much trivializes the idea that there are like men dying too and that their lives somehow matter less. And I think that like for a lot of like marginalized communities and like other discussions around intersectional issues or just men in general makes it feel like they are not valued by the feminist movement unless they are like the like the white woman who is like at the forefront of all of these discussions. And it also just makes people like not want to associate with feminism because it like seems ridiculous that they just don't value men's lives without it. So at the end of this, what do we tell you? What happens if you do not have these perceptions? We tell you have like more equitable discussions about who should be prioritized in situations. We tell you that there is less social messaging around women as being like something that needs to be protected or as someone who is like a primary caregiver. And we tell you that there is more sensitive discourse around world issues, which allows us to like advocate for people who aren't just women in situations sometimes. We tell you that we are able to get more pro-woman policy in when there isn't an overwhelming voice that there is already like too much being done for women and women are being benefited when it is like simply not true. For all these reasons, proud to affirm.
I would like to thank that speaker for that very fine speech. I would like to invite the first negative speaker up to open the negative bench case. Yeah. We were all clapping, by the way. I don't know if you could hear it.
Sorry, just setting up. I'll stop. Starting this speech in 3, 2, 1. Sorry if this is uncharitable, but I am not sure why the affirmative team wants to make the feminist move of the decade, like appealing affirmative action and like leaving women to die in Gaza over men. Pretty proud to negate here. So what, 3 things in this speech. What does this process actually look like? Secondly, I will be defending these presumptions and conventions. And thirdly, why is the process of rejecting these conventions bad for the feminist movement and bad for women? So firstly, what does this process look like? Firstly, some observations about what the app has to do in this debate. The first observation I'm going to make is that the app has to do a policy or conduct some form of ideological campaign in response to literally nothing. It is really unclear to me who is pushing for this under the status quo, besides, I don't know, like incels or nobody. This is not a mainstream belief. No one is like, like women should not be the first to go out of a war zone, or like that is a really pressing thing in our society right now. Secondly, just note that there is an asymmetry in the burden of this debate. Affirmative has to dismantle existing entrenched ideas in society. Neg does not have to support the inculcation of more of these norms. And so now let's look at what does this need to actually look like. So the feminist movement has to identify a series of presumptions to be targeted with a campaign and spend time, and I know a lot of time, dismantling them. And they have to do this because these are entrenched norms in society. And secondly, they have to fight tooth and nail to ensure that this is done perfectly. They need to ensure that these conventions, this campaign for these conventions to be rejected, don't spill over into other men's rights activist movements who think we should do things like expand the draft and capitalize on that opportunity. So at the end of this setup, we are not wedding ourselves to a counterfactual, but we literally support the feminist movement doing fucking anything instead. So moving on to a defense of these presumptions. So this argument is going to do a few things. Firstly, it's going to establish that if these presumptions are good, then this is a principled portrayal of women, because you are trading off conventions that help them for practical benefits that like derived from what, like appealing to men who are upset. Secondly, it's going to prove that they are reasonable conventions and further prove that no one is pushing for this. And lastly, explain that in the best case for affirmative, which is dismantling these norms, that is awful for women. So what are the mechs here? Firstly, these norms have an incredibly legitimate basis. The reason that we want to get women out of war zones ASAP is, sorry to be a bit harsh, is because they can get raped and used as prisoners of war, or because they are physically smaller than men on average. We don't think that that's an issue of equality. It's just an empirical fact. Like also, like the reason that women are most likely to get primary custody is because it is also empirically true that women do most of the work regarding child rearing obligations. Like the affirmative says, oh no, women can't pursue their career. No one is forcing a woman to have primary custody. If she doesn't want it, she can ask for that in court and divide it. And lastly, this also includes things like women's only privileges, like women's only train carriages in South Korea, which happen because women are at a greater threat of being harassed on public transportation. So my second defense here is that most of these things are in reaction to the historical poor treatment of women. It is a choice that the government and society, whilst in the existence of the patriarchy, has made as a form of reparations to women. Is still this debate includes things like gender-specific scholarships for women instead. This is it is an accepted convention that women are not bad at STEM, but have been excluded from these areas. So my final defense here is that there are just reasonably clear caveats to these norms. Custody challenges often fall to men, despite the fact that most empirically most child abusers are also men, because men who challenge who initiate custody challenges have good reason to do that and are likely to win. So at the end of this, you have to believe that these norms are legitimate and that dismantling them is harmful to women. And the second thing you must believe is that these things are so accepted that even to moderate sexists, they are accepted. So you only appease radicals in this debate. So why is the process of rejecting these conventions bad for the feminist movement? And the framing here is that it is important because the feminist movement has limited capital and derives most of the capital from their followers and the permeation of their ideas into society. So if you fuck with either of these things, it is so bad for the feminist movement and so bad for women. So the first question here is, why does this alienate current followers of the feminist movement? And this is a very simple first make. On a cost-benefit analysis, if a movement seems to be taking things away from you more than they are giving things to you, you probably leave in a cold and cynical manner. That a movement that promised you more rights seems to be more focused on taking away reasonable conventions in a time where, I don't know, the right to abortion in America is being taken away. Secondly, lots of feminists will not believe this, will just not believe you. To challenge a lot of deeply held beliefs based on women's experiences is probably quite offensive. Most women don't want to be drafted because they don't want to be raped in the military or subject to really awful conditions that are particularly bad for women. They probably don't want to see more abusive men getting custody because of their own experiences in abusive relationships and how that has affected them and their children. And they probably want to keep the women's only train carriages because they have had so much taken away from them already throughout history and just want to keep that one thing that they've been given. So thirdly, even if you are a feminist who believes these things, you are some sort of tomboyish feminism, is women can do these things too. It is unclear to me that you, why other women who are feminists won't alienate you when you are devoting so much energy to this in a time where there are clearly more important things to the feminist movement. As I just flagged, the right, why aren't you focusing on the right to abortion? Why aren't you focusing on honor killings? It is very unclear to me why these sorts of feminists are going to be gaining a lot of traction and popularity. So the impact here is that lots of people, even if they don't just outright leave the feminist movement and ditch it, do not engage with it as much because they feel like they are not being cared about, and they feel like it's diverted from something that they don't really understand because it is so integral and so entrenched in their to their belief system. So the second question here is, why does this harm the permeation of feminist ideology, good feminist ideology, into wider society? Firstly, this is just confusing. It is a direct contradiction of other feminist messaging that is quite strong, because a lot of messaging is about how your experiences are unique unique from those of men, and how you should be treated differently because of those experiences. So a lot of women just won't understand why you were doing this in the first place. And secondly, this forces you to validate as bizarre ideas from men. This is men's rights movements talking points about you are just validating men's rights movement's talking points. This just muddies the waters. The feminist movement loses its differential value from other movements. And lastly, you just empower a bunch of men's rights activists, and they view this as a concession of the feminist movement and that society is moving more in their direction. App is driving themselves into concession city. If you want good outcomes for women, if you want women to be happy with the feminist movement, you have to vote negative in this debate. So proud to negate.
I thank that speaker for their final remarks. I'd like to invite the second affirmative speaker up to continue the backbench case.
Just a few seconds to set up, sorry. Am I all audible? Epic. Yeah. Starting into it. When feminists are forced to defend archaic and hypocritical policies, we should probably just support egalitarianism in this case, because at the end of the day, when feminists are forced to support policies that opposition has conceded they do not need to support because they will happen anyway, we tell you this will turn off people from associating with the feminist movement, and it will lead to even further red pilling of people who are already marginalized, leading to further persecution and hatred of the feminist movement and women in general. This is an instant loss for side negative because they refuse to deal with the backlash point that we give you at RA. Okay, two things in this speech. One, I'm going to talk to you about the nature of backlash and why backlash stifles change and is the most important thing in this debate. And second of all, I'll talk about like assumptions and whether or not these are good and beneficial for women. First point, backlash. What do we tell you? I think we come out very strongly at First Affirmative by telling you that women intuitively look like these issues are very intuitively visceral for men, and that women look pretty hypocritical when they come across saying that like, oh, males' mental health doesn't matter as much, or that they say that like women should get prioritized custody within family court. It looks hypocritical and it looks stupid, especially from a movement attempting to espouse that men and women should be equal. What we propose to you as a counterfactual is that women should meet these men where they are. That is to say that when men and like especially like red pillars have this knee-jerk reaction to saying, oh, but like women are getting treated better, we simply tell you that feminists will say, no, we do not support that. We can meet them where they are. Now, how do we actually combat sexism in this case? What we tell you is now, firstly, feminists no longer look like they are massive fucking hypocrites, because now they actually do support like equality between men and women. Two, we can say that feminists can now meet people where they are. Now, this is incredibly important when we talk about like red pillars and like hardcore incels or whoever they may be. What we tell you is that these people will be completely lost and completely disassociated with the feminist movement if feminists continue to defend like hypocritical and pretty archaic stereotypes. That is to say that this is like a self-fulfilling prophecy for these like red pillars and hard incel people, because now they recognize that the feminist movement doesn't think that men and women are equal, but rather in like their sort of skewed perspective that women women get better treatment than men. How do we tell you that we deal with this? We tell you that we meet with these people where they are. What the side negative tries to come out in defense of this is simply by saying, oh, but the feminist movement is now conceding a bunch of ground to red pillars. What we tell you is that no, feminists now look so much more reasonable when the only response of red pillars, that being that like women do have certain advantages in society, like is just completely gone by the fact that feminists no longer need to defend it. Note, we would also like to note that like it isn't a massive amount of political capital at all used by the feminist movement in order to defend this. That is to say that like it is not like the feminist movement announcing a campaign saying that like we no longer support these assumptions. It is just like when you get asked a question about these assumptions, you literally just say, no, I no longer support like, I don't know, whatever, like women should be evacuated from crisis zones first. What you have to believe at the end of this point is that backlash inevitably gets worse under side negative's case. And no, the comparative. We get men under our side because of the fact that the feminist movement seems much more charitable. It seems like they're not hypocrites and like are out to like target men or whatever that may be. What this means is that we get two better policies. One, we get like broader allyship and like support for the feminist movement. That is to say that like when the feminist movement don't look toxic, like the average person is just more likely to engage in like supporting females' issues like reproductive rights, etc. But second of all, we tell you that we deal with hate speech and we deal with like things like hardcore incel activity because of the fact that these red pillars no longer have these knee-jerk responses by saying that women get treated better than men. By the fact, I think it's very telling that negative didn't give us a real response to this backlash. We tell you that feminists look much more reasonable and like they are like look like they're not hypocritical when they propose egalitarian policies. The only way that negative gets back in this debate is they try and tell you that these assumptions are positive. Like responses will be flagged. I think our first objection to this is that like these assumptions aren't useful. What will happen anyway. That is to say, we tell you at RE that like, why is it required for feminists to defend these policies for them to exist? Okay, let's think about like women getting evacuated from war zones in the first place. Like, why are women evacuated? It's not because feminists support women getting evacuated. It's because of the fact that like most women are probably a risk, like first negative tells you, like they're probably going to be used as like prisoners of war. We tell you that they're probably not serving in the military. They don't probably serve an active military purpose, but more as a liability defensively. What you have to believe at the end of this is that the feminist support of this is literally a waste of political capital. That is to say that if feminists continually talk about this issue and make this the hill to die on, they are losing ground because that is political capital they could be using elsewhere, defending things like reproductive rights or whatever. I just think it is like a natural conclusion that those in like war zones who do not serve in the military probably should be withdrawn from the war zone. We don't see like negative has failed to prove to us why feminists withdrawing their support for this will like actually lead to the change that they claim, meaning that these presumptions all disappear and all their harms do incur. Okay, two more things under this. Second of all, they tell you that this will probably be pretty controversial for feminists. What we tell you in response to this is that like feminists, like not since like the 1940s, have made it their case that it's like they want like the men not to pay on the first date, or they want women to be withdrawn from military conflicts first. Like we just don't believe this is very controversial for women to support. We think women get much more on board when it's things like issues like reproductive rights, or like rights in the workplace, or like not getting discriminated and harassed on fucking public transport. These are much more less controversial issues that are less hypocritical. And more than that, you need to weigh that controversy to all the downsides we tell you about supporting these issues. That is to say, like the backlash is just going to be far worse because women are probably going to are probably going to trend to support the feminist movement anyway. But you have to compare that against all the men you will be losing in this case when you support hypocritical and archaic policies. What do you have to believe? Okay, the third and final push about why these presumptions are bad. We actually flip this point. That is to say that we tell you at RE that like obviously like presumptive custody is a burden for women. If women are like presumed to have custody in court, like that is a burden because that means they will have to take up the majority of the child rearing. This is obviously like just a loss for side negative because women are going to have to spend like more time feeding their children. They're going to have to work more hours, and it's just going to be leading to them being worse off. What we tell you counterfactually is that like we get an egalitarian solution here because there isn't all this like public support for like making women not withdraw from war zones or whatever it may be. We tell you there is like sufficient counterfactual support for making like good egalitarian policy. What the consequences of this is that we no longer get the bad presumptive policies like women being forced to child rear in the cases of family court. And second of all, we tell you that feminists look more reasonable. So at the end of the day, are these presumptions like good for women? We tell you that one, they're probably going to exist anyway because there is already sufficient social norms. Negative has failed to prove to you why feminists are required for these assumptions, or rather presumptions to occur. What you have to believe at the end of this debate is two things. One, the support, like feminist support for like archaic and pretty hypocritical policies has like led to the feminist movement being fractionalized and like reduced support overall. This means that you get less support for the feminist movement. It becomes more toxic with red pillars. We tell you, second of all, that feminists are not required to get this action across. We are very proud to negate. Propose.
I think that's final marks. I'd like to invite the second negative speaker up to continue the negative, please.
Every week in this country, a woman is killed by an intimate partner. Every hour in India, a woman is killed because the dowry that her family provided to her new husband is insufficient. And I cannot think of anything more profoundly alienating as someone who interacts with feminists, someone who is a feminist, than the instruction from those who are influential within that movement and the behavior of those around you who participate in that movement to say that something that is of any prioritization at all is that I should be rejecting more drinks from men in bars, or that we should really do something about the way the custody is allocated for women, or as this team really hangs their hat on, despite the fact that it's an example I would be running like at the speed of sound away from if I was this affirmative team, that they shouldn't be evacuated from war zones first. Any insinuation that any of those issues are anywhere near as important as what the feminist movement's agenda and what individual feminists care about, is anywhere near as important as those things, is insulting. I'm going to do three things in this speech. I'm firstly going to explain what these presumptions are and how they operate a little bit, because I think this team acts as though when you go to court, because of this presumption, someone's going to shove a kid at you and then you just walk away, which is kind of ridiculous and not true. I'm definitely going to explain how feminists behave and how the affirmative sees the feminists behaving in their world. When that's really bad, it loses the feminist movement a lot of clout. I'm also going to explain why there is attempts at a kind of like inculcation of negative beliefs about women argument doesn't work either. Let's firstly talk about what these presumptions are. The first way that affirmative tries to win this debate is to say, actually, these are mere extensions of the patriarchy you see. It's the patriarchy in disguise. They're actually putting a whole lot of burdens onto women, which I think is patently untrue. And like, I'm going to get into the gauntlet has been thrown down by the second affirmative speaker when he calls women and feminists hypocrites. So I'm going to explain why these presumptions are actually like not fake and are not hypocritical. But let's use the custody one as an example. The reason that these presumptions exist is because it is expeditious and like reasonable in most instances to, rather than force a full custody battle or a determination of who should be the parent, if a primary caretaker, who is usually a woman, is like, yeah, I'm happy to be the primary caretaker, I'm the primary caretaker, you should probably give the kid to me, most of the time, and that is not challenged, that is by the father, that is like an okay thing to happen, and people tend to back off. And it is empirically the case that when in the Western world, that when fathers make custody challenges, they're overwhelmingly successful. So that statistic that people pull up, and undoubtedly the second affirmative pulls up, about 97% of custody matters going in favor of women, despite the fact that a very narrow percentage of them even end up in court in the first place, is just not true. These do not function as burdens to women. They function as expediting factors to secure just and sensible outcomes for issues that involve women. The second thing I'd like to note here is that this team is shockingly silent on what would really happen in the alternative. They throw around the word egalitarianism like someone who was on Tumblr in 2014, but don't actually explain that in the majority of instances, when there is no presumption from that judge that custody should go to a woman who is, say, a stay-at-home mom, then it is her husband who is still working, who has a better lawyer because he has more money, and he takes that child from her, even if she was the better parent in those circumstances. The absence of these presumptions is the status quo, which is not egalitarianism, it is patriarchy. They need to cop that status quo. They need to support it. And like that is their best case. Because their worst case is that they waste a bunch of time and alienate a bunch of people. They can't stand for the logical endpoint of the things that they are bound to support in this debate. They've lost already. Let's secondly, in this speech, explain how Affirmative sees feminists as behaving in this world. Let's be really clear what we mean by individual feminists, the feminist movement. Obviously, there is social movements are very nebulous things, but there is central influence in the way that members of that social movement should behave, and that is also inculcated and reinforced by the individual members of that social movement, like in feminism. So this probably does look like encouragement from people who are influential within that movement, and observing the behavior of influential people to encourage people to behave in this way. What does Affirmative say? The first thing that they suggest is that women, when pressed, should take a one-way ticket to Concession City and say, actually, men's rights activists, I totally agree with you. And in fact, you are right all along. And I actually think that the status quo is really unfair to men as well. That is a stupid thing to do for a couple of reasons, because it requires individual feminists taking on the burden in their day-to-day life of policing the treatment that they receive from men, the way that they engage with the legal institutions. Apparently, according to this team, whether they get evacuated first from a fucking war zone requires those individual feminists take on the burden of policing those things themselves. The second thing that it requires the people who are influential within that movement waste a bunch of time that we explain at Live to no response, rather than focusing on the dowry death every hour in India, rather than focusing on the woman a week that is killed in Australia by an intimate partner, to say, actually, the primo thing that is on the feminist agenda for 2024 is that we think that custody reform should happen. Obviously nonsensical. The second thing that they say is that, men will now be engaged in the feminist movement to a degree that they weren't before. The first observation I'd make here is that many men already are engaged in the feminist movement in many instances. They need to actually quantify what the proportionate increase of men participating in the feminist movement is. And I would note that even if you accept that this is some sort of hook, like, feminists agreed with me, that's awesome, and that hooks you in, being like a contributing member of a social movement or someone who's really useful to that cause requires more than just behavior that validates you the most, right? It requires more than just those interactions with feminists where they totally agree with what you're saying. Requires that you do the work beyond that, and they don't actually explain why the greatest proportion increases of men who are willing to do that. The second thing that I'd say, this is just a total free kick for side negative, is that it's not worth it. The reason that this is because the feminist movement is predicated on a belief of heterogeneity of experience along axes of oppression, the axis of oppression being gender. So if men can't fucking fathom why it is not hypocritical to suggest that Japan should have women-only carriages, or that women should get evacuated from war zones first, or that you probably should, to expeditiously be fair in cases of custody, tend to lean in favor of the mother, they are not useful to the feminist movement because they surely can't grasp anything else. Try to talk to these people about the way that the work within the feminist movement and what needs to get done, and they will shit their pants because they can't even handle the entry-level stuff that is so commonly accepted in society that it is a tacit belief of so many people, most of whom do not participate in the feminist movement at all. The third and final thing they say here is they say, the feminist movement won't look to the general public or publics like hypocrites. Give me a break. These policy positions are not hypocritical. What if they were? One, why would the patriarchy allow this to occur? And the way that this team tries to get around it is to say, well, these are actually really archaic beliefs. Do you know what was an archaic belief? That women could not have custody of their own children if they broke up. Like, I don't know, watch Little Women, watch the Florence Pugh monologue, where she says that if I had children and I had a husband, he would be their owner, they would be his property. That was the status quo. You could not hold custody if you got divorced because of women, like because you were a woman. That used to be the status quo. And the second thing to say is that why are they overwhelmingly supported by people who participate in patriarchy if they are widely also perceived to be hypocritical? The only logical conclusion that two set of conflicting beliefs is what we tell you at Live, which is that the group of people who seriously believe that this is hypocritical is narrowed to like them as this affirmative team and a very narrow portion of people in general society. The last issue then is on beliefs of women. They try to claim that the existence of these norms is harmful to girls upon internalization, as though they are not very clearly explained away by like literal physiological differences that you can explain as to why girls do get as strong as boys. They secondly try to claim that the inculcation of beliefs around women and things like childbearing is it's harmful. But I think they put the cart before the horse here, or like the chicken before. It's like a chicken and egg problem. Like, women tend to be domestic caregivers. That's why this norm exists, not the other way around. Then lastly, I'd say this is easily weaponizable against women because of the unfairness perception. The feminist movement has people like me defending it. I don't think it's going to work. Proud to negate.
Am I audible?
Just one moment.
Is that what I want?
Yes, thank you very much.
Cool. I want to begin this speech by talking about burdens, because it's all well and good for the negative team for two speakers have the debate that they thought they were going to have with us in prep. But the words of the motion and the iteration of the policy that we defended and fiated into the debate at First Affirmative actually do matter. So that's where I want to start, on burdens, because God, this is the most I'm negating the motion disingenuous fucking shit ever. The first observation I want to make is this motion does not state heavily prioritized or in the rhetoric of first and second negative, making this the #1 issue of feminism 2024. And it is absolutely reasonable for us to narrow this into the context wherein feminists will likely be enticed into discussions about these presumptions. And therefore, the negative team needs to engage with the particular context in which feminists in the likely status quo are likely to engage with that, right? Like, because that is what we said the debate was going to be about. That is how we fiated this motion. This is how we described that feminists would reject this. Because realistically, right, feminists don't spend any time in the status quo talking about like reifying these assumptions that are apparently so positive. Like, feminists just don't talk about how it's such an awesome thing that women get favored in family court. And I would suggest feminists kind of try to shy away from that discussion as much as they can. But there are some contexts in which a feminist, a random woman, finds a fucking frustrated man who has been hurt and burned by the family court. And there is a decision you can make in that context, right? Do you try to defend to that man that legal presumption or that social presumption that exists that women should be favored, that he's already angry at? Or do you reject that assumption? And that's the context in which I think our case starts to make quite a bit more sense than the negative team seem to imply that it does. The kinds of men who get burned by the family court because of this assumption are not hardened, in the majority of cases, hardened fucking incels and misogynists. They're people who are deeply hurt because they've lost their fucking children, and that means an awful lot to them. And it's good to be able to say to those men, yeah, we also don't really support that presumption because we think it means that women get saddled with kids and child-rearing obligations more than they ought to. And it's fuck that. Even though you've got more money and you care more about that kid and you show the fact that you would be able to take care of them better, you're your wife got sole custody, your ex-wife got sole custody. It's good for women to have that in their rhetorical arsenal. And it's good because it allows those men to not become opponents of feminism and turn their legitimate hurt at the system that has burned them into opposition to feminism. Because those men ultimately go on to vote about policies that affect women. They ultimately go on to continue to interact with women in the rest of their personal lives. And the way that they treat those women in their personal lives matters an awful fucking lot for reasons that I don't think need additional explanation. But also, the opposite is true, right? Without giving women and feminists the ability to reject these kinds of claims when they are made, it is actually quite a burden to place on people to defend these kinds of presumptions when they are interacting with someone who has been deeply harmed by or is aggrieved by that presumption. That is exactly the kind of harm that the negative team described. But also, there are cases wherein people feel dehumanized by being presented as combatants in disaster zones. For instance, the presumption that innocents look like women and children is deeply alienating, not just to men, but also to women in disaster zones. The fact that white feminists have emphasized deaths and casualties amongst women in Gaza implicitly concedes rhetorical ground to Israel that men are inherently combatants in this scenario, and Palestinian women who love their brothers and love their fathers find that deeply alienating. It makes feminism seem fucking cringe because they only care about the lives of women, even when the tangible disaster is landing around them in an indiscriminate fashion. That is where it is useful to be able to say, no, we reject that social presumption that you have that men are combatants and that women are innocent and they are more affected by war. That is a bad presumption. And that allows feminism to make inroads with people that are actually suffering the ill effects of disasters rather than shoehorning it into an ideological debate about gender that is inappropriate. Let's talk also about affirmative action. I think hardly affirmative action, like legal affirmative action, is hardly a presumption. I think it's really a conscious correction. And I feel like it's kind of out of the debate. But the idea in first negative that this is not contentious and that this is not something that faces widespread social opposition is, to put it mildly, farcical. Feminism has to defend this concept extremely strenuously. And if it is the case that we have to defend when women are asked, feminists are asked if they support affirmative action, saying, no, we support its repeal, then that's fucking fine. Like, this only really tends to benefit privileged women who are able to have access regardless because they are rich, because they are white. Like, I just don't think that this, and also makes feminism have far more opponents than it otherwise fucking would have. I'm fine to defend that. Take it on. And this is the point in my speech where I'm gonna stop being remotely charitable to the negative team and get a bit frustrated, because there are so many examples in this that are just by plain reading of the motion and our first affirmative speech, just not in the fucking debate. Like, it's not about conscripting women. Instead, feminists advocating for that. It is not about having single-sex spaces, first negative, but I'm glad that you feel the need to imply that that's straightforwardly a good thing that benefits all women. Awesome concept. This negative team also conflates the assumption that this exists, that these people have this presumption, with actual actions that translate into the real world. But I would contest that that is true. In the context of the highest impact in this debate, a sinking ship, rescuing people from war zones, it is just not true that the presumption generally that people feel that women and children should be protected, that women should be rescued, is something that has any salience. There have been research studies into maritime disasters beyond the concept where this idea of protecting women and children have been prevalent within society and have showed there is literally no difference to the survival of women after that presumption existed. And that is obviously mechanistically easy to understand, because when people are really in a disaster, when they're really in a war zone, they make specific utilitarian calculations rather than deferring to general moral rules. They look at their adrenaline and honestly, in most cases, take every man for themselves. The assumption that we don't, like, the assumption has not been proven that people believing this concept, it leads to action. And I think they ought to have done that. But even if they had done that, they haven't proven that feminism in specific cases and in specific contexts, arguing against this and opposing this assumption would be the kind of thing that would stop people in broader society deferring to that assumption where they would otherwise be likely to. Briefly on the discursive impacts on feminism. They suggest this alienates women. We suggest there are plenty of cases where it does the opposite. Women in Palestine, women burdened by child rearing, or don't feel especially empowered by the idea that there's a quid pro quo where they get more access to children, but they're essentially helpless and vessels of child rearing. And it allows a pretty useful rhetorical tactic where you can make a concession to someone who's angry with feminism to get actually something more material. Because there's a reason feminists don't spend any time talking about these presumptions, because they don't help women all that fucking much. The things that help women are protections against domestic violence. They are things like support for single mothers. Those are the things that you should use this as a rhetorical battering ram to get. This is a concession that is absolutely worth making. If we're concession city, whatever. I don't care. That concession's good. Good for women.
I thank that speaker for their fine remarks. I'd like to invite the third negative speaker to close the debate. Here.
Hello. Can I be heard? I'm going to ask 3 questions in this speech. The first of which is, what is the feminist movement actually doing on Decide Affirmative? Because there's quite a radical shift in that third speech that I'd like to address. The first push is saying that this is only about individual interactions and individual conversations, despite the pretty consistent rhetoric from that affirmative team about leaving women in disaster zones. But I will deal with this. Let's see then why, if it is just individual interactions, there is still quite a high cost to the feminist movement. First, you can't fiat an idea into the brains of every feminist. Clearly, this needs to have some level of spread. That is, the feminist movement must make this a policy platform. They must explain and they must say that you as a feminist should follow this idea of denying these kinds of things that have been afforded to you, which explains to you why it takes quite a large amount of political capital, because you have to spread this idea and a new idea to a lot of people who aren't very receptive. But 2, even if you believe you can fiat an idea into the brain of every feminist, some of those feminists are public figures, and some of them will discuss this opinion. And what this means is that it does get quite a large amount of spread, because when important people who hold important policy platforms start spouting new and strange ideas, obviously people report on it, and thus obviously people care about it. This takes then 1, a lot of fiat from the feminist movement itself, but 2, removes a lot of the discourse about feminism just onto this issue, because it's the most novel, it's the most new, and it's the most unique. But second of all, even if they are talking about just, and also just, I guess, expanding this debate back to stuff about leaving women in instances of emergencies, because they say it is just stuff about, talking to people in bars and being kind. First, I think the harm about people being dunked on by feminists when they've just lost their children relies on the fact that every feminist has no social skills. Like, obviously, if someone is a good person and has just lost their child, you can just be kind and you don't have to dunk on them. But second of all, that person likely has other forms of recourse, so it's unclear to me why that is such a huge issue in the debate. But thirdly, if we extend this to the stuff about leaving women in disaster zones, and it is just discussions, some of those discussions will presumably be between generals and between people helping people evacuate from disaster zones, which explains why, even if it is just discussions and isn't the policy that's been proposed with 1A and 2A, it is still things that are incredibly tangibly harmful to women. Finally, they try to say that this isn't about heavy prioritization and you can do other things. The previous response beats that. It takes a lot of time in order to spend this message, and a lot of people will be talking about this message. That then explains why this is a very taxing thing to do and a very difficult thing to do. I'm then going to ask the second question in this debate, which is, are these conditions good? Noting, if you believe these conditions are good, affirmative instantly lose. Okay, first, their claim is that it's bad for women because it's very infantilizing, because it's an extension of the patriarchy. First, notice, if you believe this claim, this completely obliterates that stuff about political capital, right? Because they say the patriarchy do this thing, but also the patriarchy are mad because this thing exists. Like, note that contradiction. You can't have both of these claims existing. But 2, I'll just note that this is the most baffling explanation of sexism I've ever heard. Like, ask yourself the question, did sexism exist before custodial preferencing? And if the answer is yes, this should indicate to you that repealing this will not change the amount of sexism in the world. This means that it's a very low impact claim. You don't really get a delta there. But third of all, I am just kind of baffled as to why this is just an infantilizing extension of the patriarchy and not just a reflection of legitimate concern. Like, oftentimes, this is because women are victims of sexual assault and attack. Is it infantilizing to offer a sick person medicine? Is it infantilizing then to help someone who's been a victim of a patriarchal system? Of course it isn't. This is why this exists. But second of all, the stuff about escapes from disasters and whatever, Like, I'm once again baffled by this analysis because it's not infantilizing in a narrative of patriarchy to say the average weight of a man is larger than the average weight of a woman. And when you extend that observation, it means when women aren't first, they are pushed out of the way or trampled. So it is not a one about equality or women first. This is a question in the debate about whether men first or women first. Obviously, when women experience so much structural disadvantage, we would just rather that one. The same goes for child rearing and custodial courts. We explained to you that men often have greater sources of money, and they often can just have more rep in court. And this then explains why it is more likely they disproportionately get access to children, even though they would be worse caretakers. But second of all, the example claim about how this imposes on caregiving, we first of all analyzed you can obviously just escape this if it's been unjustly pressed on you. And second of all, if the man actually would be a better caretaker, you can just appeal this decision to relatively high levels of success. As explained before, the alternative is just an unjust bias towards men in this situation. Then it should be completely unclear to you whether or not this is actually a harm to women. If you don't believe that this is single-handedly causing sexism, and you don't believe that this is truly infantilizing, you shouldn't have any affirmative case at this point. We tell you then the kinds of things that this are is one, reparatory for past harms perpetrated against women, allowing affirmative action in employment and degrees. It is protective, like having women-only zones to protect against sexual assault, things that are very clearly and very easily good for women. The summary of that issue, I have two final nails in this coffin for side affirmative. First is that we give you the rather intuitive claim that this is good for women, and maybe you don't entirely believe us, and maybe you're uncertain how to resolve that issue. You shouldn't be uncertain whether things like the pay gap is bad for women. You shouldn't be uncertain about whether decreasing access to abortion is bad for women. And so when you ask the question, would you rather spend your time on something you're repealing, not sure if would you rather spend your time on repealing something you are not sure is good, or spend your time stopping something you are sure is bad? Obviously, the second one is the better option, and that is the clearest path to victory of side negative. But second observation here is that even as this norm is incredibly awful when women opt into it, the alternative isn't forcing people to opt into this norm, right? At no point they explain coercive power for women opting into these kinds of considerations. If you can identify this to be very bad for you, you can just opt out either way. Those are two very easy ways of a negative winning this issue then. Also, finally, just a push from third affirmative. They try to claim that this norm has no salience. It means women aren't protected in a lot of instances. One, I think if this norm is as wide-reaching as they believe, such that it's people's only reason to oppose feminism, you do have to believe it compels action in some way. But second of all, there are a lot of just physical structures that exist, like women-only zones, like affirmative action, which you do just have to believe affects the lives of women tangibly. That issue then should be a clear win for side affirmative. Everything else should be kind of window dressing. Second issue then about the effect of the feminist movement and how much fine we get here. First, noting on the framing here, if you believe the best case of side affirmative, that we give a series of concessions and thus get a bigger feminist movement, it's unclear to me that that's a benefit, because if you got to the very soul of the movement to make it larger, I'm not clear what that movement is doing in the first place. Let's then go line by line in response. The first claim they have is that this propagates the narrative that women have it easy and thus makes it harder to get positive reform. First, baffling to me why we have to support the propagation of this message. As we identify too, and that is generally accepted, these messages are already kind of accepted in society. You don't really need to defend them that much, so the feminist movement isn't making this an issue. We have radio silence on this, so there's no way that this can be attached to the movement unless attacked. But second of all, we explain to you that people that do believe women have it easy will never be good feminists, right? Because the thing you're doing is saying, you're right, women have it too easy, let's make it equal. These people don't believe women have structural disadvantages, so while they campaign to fix those structural disadvantages, like obviously these are the worst possible feminists, unclear what that's benefit. But third of all, even if we do get more political capital on their side, you instantly deplete that by repealing all of the good things for women, right? Like presumably the people that join the movement only do so to get that kind of repeal. This means not actually good little soldiers in the feminist project. It's very bad. The second claim then is that analysis that comes third about the most sympathetic actor, the father who just lost their child. Obviously, I've already responded to this. There are mechanisms of recourse and nuance can exist in how you interact with these people. You can show sympathy, but still support the fact that women have structural disadvantages. Our claim here is far easier and far more easier and far clearer to understand. When you take things away from women, this ostracizes women from the feminist movement. It further makes people believe that women don't need extra support and extra protection, and thus kills any future political change and any future support for women. It is so clearly a bad idea for the feminist movement to do this, and even if you're baffled and a little bit bamboozled by the quality of these kinds of recourse, well, you shouldn't just waste time repealing them when you can do something better. Pratt again.
I'd like to thank that speaker for the. Thank you very much for a really great debate, everyone. Me and my two panelists, 15 minutes. Chill. Thanks.
Thank you.